Hey, I'm Jeremy. Welcome back to Rugby Informer. Just some quick thoughts on the discussion around the South African team's involvement in the Investec Champions Cup currently, especially after this past weekend where most of the South African sides took pretty bad beatings at the hands of their European counterparts. And it's just raised the question of whether the Champions Cup is the place for South African sides. Why are they even participating in it? If it's historically a European-based tournament, and if they were to prioritize it, how exactly would that happen? And I think from a rugby fan perspective, there's a few things to consider. I think the problem with the Investec Champions Cup as it stands at the moment is that it is the pinnacle of all rugby tournaments. Is essentially the super tournament that everyone's kind of been hoping for and wanting. And the fact that the South African sides can now participate in it, it really is creeping closer and closer to becoming that ultimate super tournament of the best clubs around the world, much like the Champions League is in the football world. The problem is the schedules, the timing, the other tournaments that are going on don't really align or cultivate South Africans to go and perform really well in the Champions Cup, unless, of course, they're playing for other teams. So from a purist rugby fan perspective, I think I can say I speak for everyone where everyone's real deep desire is to see this ultimate super competition where all the best teams are playing, whether it be the South Africans with the Europeans, throw the Kiwis in there, the Japanese sides, having a kind of de facto tournament where all the best promoted teams get to have a go at one another is, I think, the ultimate goal of every sporting discipline in the world. Kind of like an Olympic Games of rugby where you really are seeing the best players going head to head with one another. The problem is that the game is monetized, organized, and structured around the world in so many different ways, especially in the different regions around the world. Firstly, based on the history and the point of the Champions Cup, initially at least, it was geared more towards the European teams and their structure of their season. They're kind of at the tail end or halfway through the Premiership or the French Top 14, and it was a nice little gap for them to play the Champions Cup. While these teams are actually in their most pivotal points and they're actually getting into their groove halfway through the season, they're able to compete in the Champions Cup, and you tend to see the best quality rugby being played from either side. The problem for the South African sides is that most of them, especially the SA-based players who play for the Springboks, are kind of wrapping up their international season. Now these guys have to go back to their respective franchises, play some URC games, and now jump into a Champions Cup. It's basically asking way too much of most of the players. And then there's the element of most of the Springbok players being rested or not included in these Champions Cup games. And you're starting to see a lot of inexperienced players, academy players, under 21 players being brought into the senior side in order to play Toulouse away or Munster over in Ireland in their best form. So it's exactly why you're seeing these one-sided games, these dominant performances from the European teams and the South African sides who are usually more than competitive in the URC and often have won the URC. You look at the Stormers campaign or you look at the Sharks' efforts in the Challenge Cup last year, they should be performing at a high level, but their teams are just diluted from Springboks being rested, from player injuries, from just a season being way too long and not syncing up with this international European tournament. So it's a no-brainer why you're starting to see these one-sided affairs. On top of that, you're seeing a lot of the international European superstars, the guys who are playing for England and Ireland, Scotland, France. They've just come off their end-of-year tours. They've had a little bit of a nice break, and now they're going back into their franchise season in anticipation for the Six Nations will be beginning in February. So you're seeing these guys kind of hitting a great period of their conditioning. They've had a bit of rest and they're gearing up for the next season that's to come, where the South African players are kind of still see the 12-month calendar as the end of their season, whereas that European mentality that they're kind of in the middle of something that's to come. The bigger pictures of just over December break. So you're seeing a very different mentality. You're seeing different conditioning, players who've been rested, players who've been doing this for years. They know what it's like to play in two consecutive tournaments, whether it be the Premiership and the Champions Cup or the French Top 14 and the Champions Cup. South African sides traditionally would just play Super Rugby, and some of the more inexperienced guys were either playing the Currie Cup and it bled into each other a little bit, overlapped a little bit towards the end there, where some of the Springboks would swoop back into the Currie Cup final. But traditionally, they never really played two tournaments. So there's also the element of having a much deeper academy squad or a second team or just a deeper roster of players. And currently, the South African sides just don't have the pockets or the depth to provide essentially a second team that can go and play in the Champions Cup. The problem again is Toulouse, Toulon, Stade Francais, Harlequins, they're not sending their second team to go play these tournaments. They're sending their top tier. Again, it's just a complication of logistics and time. Throw in the logistics of the fact that some of these players have just come back to South Africa from various tournaments or URC or Springbok duty, and now they've got to fly back to Europe to kind of play in another game. Unless they're hosting a team here, they basically have no chance when they go over there. Another talking point in the whole picture is the way the promotion or relegation for Champions Cup works. Now, teams who win their respective divisions a year prior get entry into the Champions Cup the season after. The problem is a lot can change in rugby in 12 months. So you're seeing teams who kind of earned their eligibility more than 12, 18 months ago, now coming into an elite tournament, and things have obviously changed. Some teams have gotten better, some teams have gotten worse. So you're seeing two teams that would be seeded together 2 years ago now having to play each other. And now one team can be vastly overpowered with new signings, better form, better conditioning, playing against a team that maybe 2 years ago would have put up a better fight, but at the moment are struggling. They've been depleted of players. So maybe also looking at the promotion relegation elements of the Champions Cup, that teams kind of earn their eligibility from the winning the tournament of the very same year. That would probably deliver a more fair and balanced tournament, because you're seeing teams that are in current good form heading into the next tournament and playing basically as if they're continuing their campaign. And again, this probably ties into the scheduling and everything around that, because these competitions are bleeding into one another. So they can't determine the URC winner until the Champions Cup's already happened. Therefore, it falls into the next season's Champions Cup. So I think, what is the solution to this problem? And I think it goes back to the same solution for most of rugby's problems at the moment, is getting a synchronized global calendar between the Northern Hemisphere and the Southern Hemisphere. Rugby is now a global game. You've got South Africa as a powerhouse, New Zealand, Australia on the rise. And in the north, England, France, Wales, Ireland, Scotland, all these teams are vitally important to the international game. And they've almost kind of operated in different silos for the last couple decades. And I think there needs to be some synchronicity with their seasons. Most of the teams should be playing their domestic rugby at the same time as one another, and then having a combined tournament that has a fair promotion relegation in accordance to that same season is what's probably best. Therefore, the teams that are winning in the French Top 14 and the Premiership and the URC all go on to play each other, not teams that won a year ago playing against each other. You don't really know what's going to happen. Too much has changed over the last couple of months. So it kind of flows into one another rather than being stagnated and broken up. It's just a result of the way things are structured at the moment. But unfortunately, we're starting to see the gap become glaringly obvious more and more as international seasons change, more games are added, new series are going to be introduced next year. It's only going to get worse. So I think it's best if the powers that be combine, get in front of each other on a table and try and come up with some sort of solution to get the teams on board with a more comprehensive structure where every team's kind of playing their respective domestic leagues kind of at the same time. At least it'll result in a better competition. Another angle to look at, and most rugby fans will probably not like it, is that there is just too much rugby. There's just too many international games being played. There's too many franchise games in the URC and all these other tournaments. Yeah, you want to see every team play each other once or twice, like old Super Rugby days. But the reality is, if you have 16, 12 more teams in a competition, throw in some buys in the middle of all of that, it just takes up way too much time. So maybe whether it's a conference system for the URC or splitting some of these competitions into a tier 1 and tier 2 competition with promotion relegation also makes that more interesting, because now a wooden spoon game in tier 1 becomes pivotally important for that franchise. All the fans get behind those teams rather than it just being a dead rubber. If you haven't had a few good first rounds, you're basically out of the competition. So there's just too much rugby being played. Throw in all the international games. Most of these guys' bodies are probably taking an absolute beating. And again, the public interest starts to dwindle towards the end of the year. as much of a rugby fan as everyone is, especially in South Africa or Ireland or anywhere in the world, it is hard to keep track of so many tournaments, especially when they're being played consecutively, especially off the back of a World Cup or a very busy international season that's taken up a lot of time, both for the players and the spectators. Maybe the powers that be also need to just look at focusing on quality over quantity, less games that are absolute bangers rather than a whole bunch of rugby where most of the people are not really that interested in watching. So less is more with regards to a more global calendar in my mind, and it'll just open up the doors for some really great kind of super tournament possibilities. But that's just what I think. Again, I can't solve the rugby world's problems in 10 odd minutes, but I'd love to know what you guys think. Please comment down below. Let us know what you think of a global tournament, a super tournament. Do you think less rugby will result in better rugby? Please comment down below and leave your thoughts. Please hit like and subscribe. It also helps the channel, and I'll see you guys in the next one.